Sometimes the things we can't see are the only things that truly matter. The Montana wind cut through Bitterroot Valley like a rusty blade that October morning, carrying the scent of early snow and something else, something that made old Ezra Blackwood pause on his porch steps, his weathered hand gripping the rail. 15 years of blindness had sharpened his other senses to an almost preternatural degree, and right now every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. The whimpering started low, barely audible above the wind's howl. Ezra had heard plenty of distressed animals in his 7 decades, cattle in labor, coyotes caught in traps, his own border collie when she'd been struck by lightning. But this sound was different, desperate, almost human. He lowered himself carefully to his knees, ignoring the arthritis that flared in his joints, and felt his way under the porch. His calloused fingers expected to find fur, maybe a litter of abandoned farm dogs. Instead, they touched warm, smooth skin, impossibly soft, human skin. 3 babies, naked, but somehow not cold. No blankets, no bassinets, no sign of how they'd gotten there. On his isolated ranch, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, in the middle of a building snowstorm. How does a blind man protect 3 mysterious infants when he can't even see who or what might be hunting them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra's breath caught in his throat as tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. The baby's grip was warm, impossibly warm given the frigid morning air that had already begun crystallizing on the porch railings above. He counted again with trembling hands. 3 infants, none appearing older than a few months, all breathing steadily despite being completely exposed to the elements. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then immediately felt foolish for blasphemy in the presence of what might be a miracle, or something far worse. The logical part of his mind, the part that had managed a working cattle ranch for 47 years and survived 15 years of darkness, catalogued the impossibilities. No tire tracks on the gravel drive, his hearing would have caught an engine long before it reached the house. No footprints in the early frost, he'd felt the undisturbed crystals beneath his boots on the way to fetch firewood. The babies weren't crying from cold, weren't blue-lipped or shivering. They lay on bare earth as if it were the softest down mattress. Ezra had learned to trust his enhanced senses above all else since the stampede took his sight. Right now, those senses told him 2 conflicting truths. These were human babies who needed immediate care, and something about this situation defied every natural law he understood. The wind picked up, driving the first real snowflakes against his back. Whatever impossible circumstances had brought these children here, they couldn't stay under the porch. He began the delicate process of extracting them one by one, marveling at how docile they remained. No crying, barely any movement except for those remarkably strong little fingers that seemed to seek out contact with his weathered hands. The first baby, a girl he determined, felt no heavier than a bag of feed grain, but solid and real. He cradled her against his chest and felt his way back to the porch steps, then repeated the journey twice more. By the time he had all 3 children inside his kitchen, his heart was hammering with an intensity he hadn't felt since those terrifying first months after losing his sight. The warmth of the wood stove seemed to please them. Ezra arranged them on his kitchen table, using dish towels as makeshift blankets, and tried to think. The nearest phone was in Millerville, 20 miles of increasingly treacherous mountain road. Sheriff Carlisle would ask questions Ezra couldn't answer. Social services would take the babies away before he could even begin to understand how they'd survived the night outdoors. More troubling was his growing certainty that these children weren't entirely normal. Their breathing was too even, too quiet. Their body temperature defied explanation. And there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. The middle child, a boy, made a soft cooing sound, and suddenly Ezra's kitchen vanished. He stood in blazing sunlight on a ridge he recognized, though he hadn't seen it in 15 years. The old ponderosa pine with the lightning scar, the granite outcropping shaped like a horse's head. Below, In the valley that now belonged to his ranch, a small collection of teepees dotted the grassland beside a creek that had since run dry. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played at the water's edge. A woman with long black hair braided with beads looked directly at him across the impossible distance and smiled with infinite sadness. The vision lasted only seconds before Ezra's kitchen crashed back around him. He gripped the table edge, gasping, his mind reeling. In 47 years of living on this land, he'd found plenty of artifacts, arrowheads, pottery shards, the occasional piece of worked leather. Old Jim Crow Feather from the reservation had told him stories of the families who'd lived here before the government surveys, before the land grants that eventually led to the Blackwood Ranch. Families who had simply vanished one winter, leaving no trace except the stories. The baby boy cooed again, and Ezra jerked his hand back as if burned. The vision remained just out of reach, but the emotion lingered, profound loss mixed with something that felt like hope. Outside, the storm was building. The wind moaned through the eaves with a sound almost like voices, and snow ticked against the windows with increasing urgency. Ezra had perhaps an hour before the mountain road became impassable. After that, he and the mysterious children would be completely cut off from the outside world until the storm passed. Part of him, the part that had spent 15 years learning to navigate by instinct and trust, whispered that this isolation might be exactly what was needed, that whatever force had placed these impossible children under his porch had chosen both the location and the timing with careful precision. The babies lay peaceful and warm on his kitchen table, three small mysteries that had already begun reshaping his understanding of the world. As the storm closed around his ranch like a protective cocoon, Ezra Blackwood made a decision that would change everything. He would keep them safe, no matter what they were, even if it killed him. The decision settled into his bones like winter cold, absolute and irreversible. Ezra stood motionless beside the kitchen table, listening to the storm strengthen outside while the three impossible children breathed their two quiet breaths. 15 years of careful routine, the methodical life he'd built from the wreckage of his blindness, suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. He'd need supplies. Formula, diapers, blankets designed for human babies rather than dish towels. The general store in Millerville would have the basics, but that meant leaving the children alone, meant risking questions from Martha Henderson, who'd run the place since Ezra was knee-high to a grasshopper. Martha had a tongue that wagged faster than a dog's tail and eyes that catalogued every purchase, for later gossip over coffee at the diner. More pressing was the matter of milk. The babies would need feeding soon, and his coffee creamer wasn't going to suffice. He had a Holstein cow, Bessie, unimaginatively named by his late wife Ruth, but fresh milk for human infants required boiling, cooling, careful preparation he hadn't attempted in decades. The girl baby made a soft sound, drawing his attention. As his fingers found her tiny hand, another fragment of vision flickered through his mind. The same ridge, but in winter, snow swirling around the abandoned valley, while voices carried on the wind in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Come home. Come home. Come home." He jerked back, heart hammering. This was madness. 72 years of Methodist rationality warred against the evidence of his enhanced senses. The babies were wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, too warm, too quiet, too perfectly content for children who should be screaming with hunger and cold. The phone rang. Ezra's blood froze. 3 sharp jangles from the rotary phone mounted beside his kitchen door, the only concession to modernity Ruth had managed to install before the cancer took her. He counted the rings. 5, 6, 7. On the 9th ring, it stopped. Sheriff Carlisle always let it ring 9 times when checking on him before storms, a courtesy call that happened 3 or 4 times each winter, making sure the stubborn blind man wasn't going to freeze to death in his own kitchen. Normally, Ezra appreciated the gesture, even if he pretended to find it irritating. Today, he'd never been more grateful to miss a call in his life. But Carlisle would try again, might even drive out if the road stayed passable another hour. The sheriff took his duty seriously. especially regarding what he considered the vulnerable folks in his jurisdiction. At 68, Tom Carlyle was only 4 years younger than Ezra, but he'd taken to treating him like a fragile elder ever since the accident. The wind howled through the eaves with renewed fury, rattling windows and sending something metallic clanging against the barn, probably the loose sheet of roofing he'd been meaning to secure before winter set in properly. Now he was grateful for his procrastination. The storm would make travel impossible within the hour, buying him time to think, time to figure out how to care for 3 infants who might not be entirely human. He moved to his kitchen cabinets with the fluid efficiency of 15 years' practice, hands finding supplies by touch and position memory. Clean rags, a mixing bowl, the bottle of hydrogen peroxide he kept for treating small injuries. If these children were going to stay, and God help him, he'd already decided they were, he needed to ensure they weren't carrying disease or infection. As he gathered supplies, his mind wandered to the life he'd built in this kitchen, this house, this isolated valley that had been his whole world since Ruth's passing. The careful routines that governed his days, morning coffee at 5:30, feeding the livestock at 6, checking fence lines and water sources through the morning hours, lunch at noon sharp, afternoon maintenance and paperwork, dinner at 6, reading time with his Braille books until 9 o'clock, when he'd listen to the radio news and weather report. It was a spare existence, but it was his. Every neighbor for 20 miles knew not to expect much sociability from Ezra Blackwood. He attended church on Christmas and Easter to keep up appearances, traded cattle at the spring and fall auctions, paid his bills on time, and otherwise left the world alone in exchange for the same courtesy. The babies had shattered that careful isolation in the space of an hour. The boy-child stirred, tiny mouth working as if nursing. Soon they'd need feeding, and his careful world of measured routines would need to expand to accommodate the chaotic demands of infant care. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 15 years of proving he could manage a ranch without sight, he was about to discover if he could manage motherhood without a clue. Outside, the storm's voice grew stronger, and for just a moment, Ezra could swear he heard something else in the wind. Singing, maybe, or chanting in that same unknown but familiar language from his vision. "Come home! Come home! Come home!" The babies slept on, impossibly peaceful, while his old life died quietly around them. The phone rang again. This time, it didn't stop at 9 rings. Ezra counted past 15, past 20, the shrill jangling cutting through the storm's voice like an accusation. Sheriff Carlyle wasn't giving up. The man had probably already pulled on his heavy coat and was eyeing the patrol car, debating whether the roads were still passable enough for a welfare check. Ezra's hands clenched into fists. Answer and face impossible questions about crying sounds Carlyle might have heard over the phone line. Ignore it and guarantee a visit from the one man in 3 counties with both the authority and the determination to enter his home uninvited. On the 23rd ring, he lifted the receiver. "Ezra? Jesus, I was about to drive out there." Tom Carlyle's voice carried the particular blend of relief and irritation that had defined their friendship for 40 years. "Storm's getting nasty. You got enough firewood, generator working?" "I'm fine, Tom." Ezra kept his voice steady, angling his body between the phone and the kitchen table where 3 impossible children lay sleeping. "Plenty of wood, plenty of supplies. No need for you to risk the roads." "Good, good. Radio's calling for 18 inches by morning, maybe more. You won't be seeing civilization for a few days." A pause, static crackling over the line. "You sure you're all right? You sound different." The boy baby chose that moment to make a soft cooing sound. Ezra coughed loudly, praying the storm noise would mask it. "Just tired, Tom. Long morning checking the livestock before the weather turned." Another pause. Longer this time. Sheriff Tom Carlyle hadn't survived 3 decades in law enforcement by missing the subtle wrongness in a man's voice. "Ezra, is there something you need to tell me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Tell him about the impossible children who'd appeared under his porch, about visions of people who'd been dead for decades, about the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than 3 abandoned babies. "Nothing to tell," Ezra said. "Just want to get off the phone before this storm knocks the lines down." "All right." But Carlyle's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll check on you again when this weather clears. Maybe drive out. Make sure your generator didn't give you any trouble." The line went dead, leaving Ezra holding the receiver like a weapon he couldn't figure out how to disarm. Tom Carlyle checking on him in person meant questions, scrutiny, the kind of attention that would make hiding 3 infants impossible. He had perhaps 3 days, maybe 4 if the storm was as bad as predicted, before the sheriff came knocking. 3 days to figure out what these children were and what they needed from him. The girl baby stirred, tiny face scrunching with the first signs of hunger. As if summoned by her movement, the other 2 began to wake as well, small mouths working instinctively. They'd need feeding soon, and his kitchen suddenly felt woefully inadequate for the task ahead. Ezra moved to his pantry, hands searching for anything that might serve. A can of evaporated milk, dusty from disuse. Honey? No. He dimly remembered something about honey being dangerous for infants. His fingers closed around a box of oatmeal, and he nearly laughed at the absurdity. 15 years of bachelor living hadn't prepared him for this. As he stood there cataloguing his meager supplies, another wave of vision crashed over him. This time, he didn't fight it. The same valley, but different. Spring instead of winter. The creek running full and clear. Children played in the meadow grass while women worked hides near carefully banked fires. But something was wrong with the scene. The colors too vivid, the sounds too sharp, as if he were experiencing it through senses more acute than human sight had ever been. One of the women looked up from her work, and Ezra's breath caught. She was young, maybe 20, with the distinctive cheekbones and deep-set eyes he'd learned to recognize from his occasional dealings with folks from the reservation. But her gaze held a weight of sorrow that seemed ancient, and when she spoke, he understood her words despite never hearing the language before. "The children must come home," she said, her voice carrying impossible distances. "The debt must be paid." The vision shattered, leaving Ezra gasping against his kitchen counter. The babies on the table had begun to fuss in earnest now, their previously supernatural contentment giving way to very human needs. But as he approached them, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Their eyes, all 3 pairs, were open and focused directly on him. Impossible. Newborns couldn't focus, couldn't track movement, couldn't display the kind of alert intelligence he saw in those dark gazes. But these children were watching him with an awareness that spoke of understanding far beyond their apparent age. The choice crystallized before him like ice forming on still water. He could bundle them up, drive to Millerville through the storm, turn them over to authorities, and return to his careful, isolated existence. Let someone else puzzle out their impossible nature. Or he could step fully into whatever supernatural current had brought them to his porch, accepting that his old life, his safe life, was already over. Outside, the storm sang with voices that might have been wind, might have been something else entirely. The babies watched him with their 2 knowing eyes, waiting for his decision. Ezra Blackwood reached for the evaporated milk, but his hand stopped 6 inches from the can, trembling like a leaf in autumn wind. Sweat beaded his forehead, despite the kitchen's chill, as doubt crashed over him with the force of a spring flood. What the hell was he thinking? Ezra's breathing came shallow and quick. 3 babies. 3 impossible, unnatural babies that watched him with eyes too knowing, too old. And here he stood, a 72-year-old blind man who could barely manage his own care some days, contemplating, what? Playing nursemaid to creatures that might not even be human? The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 15 years of navigating a world gone dark, screamed warnings. He knew nothing about infant care. Ruth had miscarried twice before they'd stopped trying, dreams of children buried alongside hopes they'd learned not to voice. His knowledge of babies began and ended with the livestock he'd helped birth over 5 decades of ranching. And these weren't normal babies. The memory of their too-perfect silence under the porch haunted him. No crying, no fussing, just that eerie contentment while October snow fell around them. The visions they somehow projected into his mind violated every natural law he understood. The way they focused on him with intelligence that belonged to beings months or years older. What if he was losing his mind? What if 15 years of isolation had finally cracked something essential in his brain? Old Jim Crowfeather had warned him once that men weren't meant to live alone for so long, that the land itself could play tricks on a solitary soul. Maybe he'd finally succumb to whatever madness claimed hermits. The girl baby made a soft sound, not quite crying but insistent, hungry. And suddenly Ezra was back to the immediate problem of 3 infants who needed food he didn't have, care he couldn't provide, and attention he couldn't give without destroying the carefully constructed isolation that had become his lifeline. His hands shook as he gripped the kitchen counter. The smart thing, the sane thing, would be to bundle them up, make the drive to Millerville before the roads became impossible. Let Sheriff Carlisle handle the questions. Let social services puzzle out their origins, return to his ordered world of morning coffee and evening radio, of problems he could solve and routines that made sense. But even as the thought formed, he heard Tom Carlisle's voice in his memory. "Ezra, is there something you need to tell me?" The sheriff's instincts were sharp as winter wind. Questions would lead to investigations. Investigations would lead to attention from people far less sympathetic than small-town law enforcement. And something deep in his gut whispered that these children, whatever they were, couldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. The boy baby stirred, and for a terrifying moment, Ezra braced for another vision. Instead came only the mundane reality of an infant working up to cry in earnest. The sound, when it came, was perfectly normal, high, demanding, absolutely human. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it highlighted everything he couldn't do. He had no formula, no bottles, no diapers, no experience with the complex dance of keeping helpless beings alive. His nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and Martha Henderson at the general store would want explanations for sudden baby supply purchases that he couldn't provide. The children would need constant care, feeding every few hours, diaper changes, the kind of vigilant attention that would shatter his routines completely. And what about when they grew older? How did you explain 3 children with no paperwork, no birth certificates, no legal existence? How did you enroll mysterious foundlings in school, get them medical care, navigate the bureaucratic maze that surrounded normal childhood? His breathing hitched as the full magnitude crashed over him. This wasn't just about tonight or tomorrow. This was about reshaping his entire existence around beings whose very nature defied explanation, about becoming responsible for lives when he could barely manage his own some days. The storm rattled the windows with renewed fury, and somewhere in that sound he heard echoes of the singing from his visions. Come home, come home. But whose home? And from where were they coming? Fear crawled up his spine as darker possibilities surfaced. What if the visions weren't memories but warnings? What if something was looking for these children, something that wouldn't hesitate to eliminate an old blind man who stood in the way? His ranch sat at the end of a dead-end road, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to neighbors, perfect for someone who wanted privacy for unpleasant work. The rational choice stared him in the face: drive to town, turn them over to authorities, return to safety, let someone else shoulder the impossible burden of caring for the impossible children. But as he stood there, paralyzed by doubt and fear, the babies watched him with their 2 knowing eyes, patient, waiting, as if they understood his struggle and accepted whatever choice he made. The evaporated milk sat 6 inches away, close as salvation or damnation. Outside, the storm sang its ancient songs, and Ezra Blackwood discovered that some choices could terrify a man, even as they called to his deepest soul. His fingers closed around the cold metal of the evaporated milk can. The moment he lifted it from the shelf, something shifted inside Ezra's chest. a sensation like a door swinging shut behind him with a finality that echoed through his bones. There would be no going back now. The careful life he'd built, the ordered existence that had sustained him through 15 years of darkness, was already becoming memory. He set the can on the counter with hands that no longer trembled. The fear remained, but it had transformed into something else. Acceptance, maybe, or the peculiar calm that came when a man stopped fighting the current and let the river carry him where it would. The baby's cries grew more insistent, their supernatural patience finally giving way to basic human need. Ezra moved through his kitchen with new purpose, gathering what he could: clean dishcloths that would serve as makeshift diapers, a mason jar he could fashion into a feeding bottle, strips of cotton that might work for ties and bindings. His movements felt different, charged with the kind of certainty he hadn't experienced since the morning Ruth died. As he worked, another vision flickered at the edges of his consciousness, not the overwhelming flood of images from before, but gentler whispers of understanding. He saw himself mixing the milk with warm water, testing the temperature against his wrist the way he'd seen Martha Henderson do with her grandchildren. Saw his hands moving with confidence he didn't yet possess, cradling tiny bodies with a care that would become second nature. The visions weren't just showing him the past anymore, they were teaching him the future. The storm's voice changed outside his windows, no longer howling but settling into the steady drone that meant serious accumulation. By morning, the road to Millerville would be impassable even with chains. Sheriff Carlisle's promised visit was days away now, not hours. Time enough to learn what these children needed from him. Time enough to discover what he was becoming. Ezra filled his kettle and set it on the stove, muscle memory guiding him through motions that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. As the water heated, he approached the kitchen table where 3 impossible lives waited for his commitment to their care. The girl baby. He'd started thinking of her as the eldest, though he had no rational basis for the distinction, fixed her dark eyes on his face. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of Ruth in those final weeks, when pain medication had stripped away everything except the essential core of who she was. A kind of ancient wisdom wrapped in terrible vulnerability. "I don't know what you are," he whispered to her, to all of them. "Don't know where you came from or what brought you to my porch, but I know what happened to your people before, whoever they were, however long ago it was. I've seen enough to understand that much." The kettle's whistle pierced the kitchen's quiet. Ezra turned off the burner and began mixing the milk, his hands steady despite having no real idea what he was doing. The proportions felt right somehow, guided by intuition he was learning to trust. As he worked, he found himself talking to the children, not the baby talk that other people used, but real conversation, as if they could understand every word. Maybe they could. "There's going to be questions eventually," he said, testing the milk mixture against his wrist. "Tom Carlisle's a good man, but he's still law enforcement. Martha Henderson at the store talks too much, and Doc Brennan would want to examine you properly if word got around about babies appearing out of nowhere." The boy baby made a soft sound that might have been agreement. "So we'll need to be careful. Smart. Give me time to figure out how to explain you before the world comes knocking." He pierced a small hole in the jar lid, creating a makeshift nipple. "Give me time to understand what you need me to do." When he lifted the girl baby from the table, she fit perfectly in the crook of his arm, as if he'd been holding infants all his life instead of learning the motion 30 seconds before. She took to the improvised bottle immediately, tiny hands gripping his fingers with surprising strength. The connection between them deepened as she fed, and Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced since Ruth's death, the profound responsibility of being needed absolutely by another living soul. It was terrifying and beautiful and completely transformative. Outside, the storm continued its ancient work, burying the road that led back to his old life under layers of snow and ice. When spring came and the world thawed, Ezra Blackwood would be a different man entirely. The children would see to that. He settled into his kitchen chair, cradling the feeding infant, while her siblings waited their turn with supernatural patience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossibilities to navigate. But tonight, in the lamplit warmth of his kitchen, an old blind cowboy learned the first lesson of the journey ahead. Sometimes the most dangerous threshold you could cross was the one that led toward love. The girl baby finished feeding as the mantel clock chimed midnight, her tiny body growing heavy with satisfied sleep. Ezra had barely settled her back onto the improvised bed when sharp knocking shattered the kitchen's peace. 3 deliberate raps on his front door, too late for social calls, too early for emergencies that couldn't wait until morning. His blood turned to ice water as he recognized the pattern. 2 quick knocks, pause, 1 firm knock. The same signal Tom Carlyle had used for 15 years when he wanted to distinguish himself from drifters or door-to-door salesmen. The sheriff had decided not to wait for the storm to pass. Ezra's mind raced through impossible calculations. The babies lay exposed on his kitchen table, bottles and makeshift diapers scattered across the counter like evidence at a crime scene. No time to hide them, nowhere to take them that wouldn't raise more questions than it answered. The storm that should have been his protection had betrayed him. "Ezra, it's Tom. Saw your lights were still on." The voice carried the particular tone Carlyle used when he was being careful, patient but determined, the sound of a lawman who suspected something but hadn't decided what yet. Ezra forced himself to breathe normally as he called back, "Coming, Tom. Give me a minute." He moved toward the kitchen table, hands hovering over the sleeping children. The boy baby chose that moment to stretch, tiny fist uncurling like a flower. Impossibly, all 3 remained silent, that same supernatural contentment they'd displayed under the porch, as if they understood the danger and were trying to help him navigate it. Another knock, more insistent now. "Road's getting bad out here, Ezra. Mind if I come in?" The question wasn't really a question. Tom Carlyle was coming inside whether Ezra minded or not, and they both knew it. Ezra grabbed a large dish towel from the counter and spread it gently over the babies, praying the dim lamplight would disguise what lay beneath. He opened the front door to find the sheriff stamping snow from his boots, hat pulled low against the wind. Tom was a decade younger than Ezra but looked older tonight, lines of concern etched deep around his eyes. His gaze swept the entryway with professional thoroughness before settling on Ezra's face. "Hell of a storm," Tom said, shrugging out of his coat. "Figured I'd better check on you before it gets worse. Road's already dicey, and you know how these October blizzards can be." "Appreciate it," Ezra replied, stepping back to let him enter, "though you didn't need to risk the drive. I've weathered worse storms than this." "Have you?" Something in the sheriff's tone made Ezra's spine stiffen. "Because Martha Henderson mentioned you seemed unsettled when you came by her store yesterday, said you were asking odd questions about baby supplies." The words hit like physical blows. Ezra's mouth went dry as he remembered his clumsy attempts to gather information without arousing suspicion. Apparently, he'd failed more spectacularly than he'd realized. "Just curious," he managed. "Martha's always going on about her grandchildren. Man gets to wondering what he missed, I suppose." Tom's boots clicked against the hardwood as he moved deeper into the house, and Ezra realized with growing horror that the sheriff was heading directly toward the kitchen, toward the evidence that would destroy any hope of protecting the children. "Tom," he said quickly, "coffee's cold, but I could put on a fresh pot if you're planning to stay." "Don't trouble yourself." The sheriff paused at the kitchen threshold, and Ezra heard the subtle shift in his breathing that meant he was studying something carefully. "Just want to make sure everything's all right here. You know how folks worry about you, living alone like this." The kitchen fell silent except for the storm's voice and the soft hiss of the oil lamp. Ezra stood frozen in his own doorway, blind to whatever Tom Carlyle was seeing, but certain it was too much. Then the dish towel moved. Just a slight flutter, barely visible in the lamplight, but enough to reveal the unmistakable outline of a tiny foot. Tom's sharp intake of breath confirmed Ezra's worst fears. "Ezra," the sheriff's voice had gone flat, professional. "What exactly is under that towel?" No lies would serve now. No clever explanations could account for what Tom had seen. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Ezra understood that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of 3 impossible children who had somehow become his responsibility. The boy baby stirred beneath the towel, and in that soft sound, Ezra heard echoes of the visions that had been reshaping his world. Ancient sorrows, decades-old injustices, and the weight of promises made by people long dead. Tom Carlyle waited for an explanation that could never satisfy the truth. Outside, the storm sang its relentless song, and Ezra Blackwood discovered that some secrets were too large for any man to carry alone. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each second adding weight that threatened to snap everything Ezra had tried to protect. Tom Carlyle's breathing had changed, shallow, controlled, the way a man breathed when his hand was moving toward his service weapon. Not drawing it, not yet, but ready. "Babies," Ezra said finally, the word falling into the kitchen like a stone into still water. 3 of them. Babies. Tom's voice carried no inflection, giving away nothing. "On your kitchen table, in the middle of a blizzard. Found them this morning, under the porch." Ezra's hands hung loose at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run, though there was nowhere to go. They were abandoned. The dish towel moved again, and this time Tom stepped closer, his boots creaking against the floorboards. Ezra heard the soft whisper of cloth being pulled back, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the storm itself. "Jesus Christ!" The sheriff's voice cracked on the words. "Ezra, these babies, how long have they been here?" "Since morning. Maybe earlier." The truth felt strange in his mouth. Not the whole truth, but enough to navigate this moment without outright lies. "I heard whimpering. Went to investigate." Tom's breathing hitched. "They're so small, hours old, maybe less. And they've been outside in this weather?" Another pause, longer this time. "They should be dead." The observation hung in the air like an accusation. Ezra felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the kitchen's chill. Tom was a good sheriff precisely because he noticed things that didn't add up, and 3 healthy infants surviving exposure that should have killed them was the kind of impossibility that would eat at the man until he found answers. "Wrap them up quick as I could," Ezra said. "Got them warm. Fed them some milk." "Fed them." Tom's tone had shifted again, professional suspicion warring with something that might have been relief. "You know anything about caring for newborns, Ezra?" Learning fast, the understatement of his life, but Tom didn't need to know about visions that taught him things he'd never learned, about impossible knowledge flowing from children who weren't entirely human. Common sense, mostly. Common sense. Tom moved around the table, and Ezra tracked his progress by sound. The creak of floorboards, the rustle of clothing, the subtle changes in how his voice bounced off the walls. "And you didn't think to call me? Or Doc Brennan?" "These babies need medical attention, Ezra. They need protection." The words escaped before Ezra could stop them, carrying weight he hadn't intended to reveal. The kitchen fell silent again, and he felt Tom's attention focus on him with laser intensity. Protection from what? This was the moment. The crossroads where careful truth might serve better than desperate lies. Ezra had known Tom Carlyle for 15 years, had watched him handle delicate situations with more wisdom than most men possessed. If anyone could understand the larger picture without destroying it, it might be the sheriff. "But how did you explain visions of government men in black cars? How did you describe the certainty that these children were connected to injustices that ran deeper than one old cowboy could fathom? How did you make someone believe that bureaucratic machinery designed to help children might be the very force that would destroy them?" "They're people," Ezra said carefully, "whoever left them. There's more to this story than abandoned babies. I can feel it." "Feel it." Tom's voice carried a note Ezra recognized, the sound of a man deciding whether to trust instincts or procedure. "Ezra, I've known you long enough to respect your judgment, but 3 newborns don't just appear out of nowhere. Someone gave birth to these children recently, that someone needs medical attention and these babies need proper care. They're getting proper care. Are they? Tom's footsteps moved closer, and Ezra braced himself. Because from where I'm standing, I see 3 infants who should be in the hospital. I see evidence of neglect that could... The girl baby chose that moment to coo softly, a sound of perfect contentment that cut through Tom's building lecture like a blade. The sheriff's words died mid-sentence, and Ezra heard his sharp intake of breath. That's not normal, Tom whispered. Newborns they don't sound like that. Another silence. This one heavy with questions neither man wanted to voice. The storm rattled the windows, and somewhere in that sound, Ezra heard echoes of ancient songs. The children remained impossibly calm, watching Tom Carlyle with eyes that held too much knowledge for beings hours old. No, Ezra said quietly, they don't. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an abyss. Tom Carlyle had 2 choices now: follow procedure and tear apart something that defied understanding, or step into mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. Outside, the storm sang its relentless song, and 2 men stared into the darkness between duty and truth, knowing that some decisions would haunt them regardless of which path they chose. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, pressing against the kitchen walls like a living thing. Tom Carlyle stood over the babies, his breathing shallow and measured, while Ezra waited for judgment that could shatter everything. Then Tom's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. Watch your 20, Sheriff." The electronic voice cut through the tension like a gunshot. Tom's hand moved automatically toward his shoulder mic, then stopped. Ezra heard the hesitation in that aborted movement, duty pulling against something else, something the sheriff was still trying to understand. "Unit 7, please respond. We've got reports of a vehicle off the road on Highway 12. Tom's breathing changed again, deeper now, the sound of a man making a decision that would define him. His radio continued to crackle with urgent requests, but he didn't answer. Instead, Ezra heard the soft whisper of cloth as the sheriff pulled the dish towel back over the babies. "My 20 is secure," Tom said finally, keying his mic. "Highway 12's impassable in this weather. Send county snowplow to clear the route at first light. I'll investigate then." "Copy that, Sheriff. Be advised, we also have a welfare check request for the Blackwood Ranch. Caller was concerned about..." Tom switched off the radio with a sharp click. The kitchen fell silent except for the storm and the soft breathing of 3 impossible children. Ezra felt the weight of Tom's stare, could almost hear the calculations running through the sheriff's mind. Professional obligation warring with instinct that something larger was at play here. "Someone called about you," Tom said finally. "Anonymous tip. Said they saw strange lights around your property last night, heard what sounded like crying." Ice formed in Ezra's stomach. Who would? Could be anyone. Martha Henderson's got a mouth on her, and your nearest neighbor's only 3 miles away. Sound carries on still nights. Tom's footsteps moved around the table again, restless energy seeking outlet. "Point is, this isn't going away. Questions are being asked." The boy baby stirred under the towel, making that soft cooing sound that had unnerved Tom moments before. This time the sheriff didn't comment, but Ezra heard his sharp intake of breath. "There's something else," Tom continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Reason I came out here tonight, instead of waiting for morning. Got a call from the FBI field office in Billings this afternoon." Ezra's blood turned to ice water. FBI? Agent asking about missing persons reports from this area, specifically Native American families. Said they were following up on some old cases, wanted to know if we'd had any unusual activity lately. Tom paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried new weight. "Asked particularly about your property, Ezra. Wanted to know if you'd reported anything strange." The visions crashed into Ezra's consciousness without warning. Flashes of black cars on mountain roads, men in suits asking questions, families who disappeared in the night and were never seen again. The girl baby under the towel made a sound like singing, so soft it might have been the wind, but Tom jerked like he'd been struck. "That sound," the sheriff whispered. "What is that sound?" Ezra's hands began to shake. The federal interest wasn't coincidence. It was connected to whatever had brought these children to his porch. The conspiracy he'd glimpsed in fragments was real, and it was closing in. "Tom," he said urgently, "whatever you're thinking about doing, calling social services, reporting this to the FBI, don't. Not yet. Ezra, I can't just—" 24 hours. The desperation in his own voice surprised him. "Give me 24 hours to figure out what we're dealing with. Then we'll talk about next steps." 24 hours? Tom's laugh held no humor. 3 newborns need medical attention now, not tomorrow. And if the FBI's asking questions, the FBI's not here to help these babies. The certainty in Ezra's voice seemed to give Tom pause. Whatever they want, it's not in those children's best interest. A long silence, punctuated by the storm's relentless voice. Then Tom sighed, a sound heavy with reluctant decision. "I should arrest you," he said quietly. "Child endangerment, failure to report abandoned minors, probably 6 other charges. Book you and turn those babies over to protective services. But you're not going to." "No," Tom admitted. "I'm not. Because something about this whole situation feels wrong, and I've learned to trust that feeling." His footsteps moved toward the door, then stopped. "But Ezra, if those babies are hurt, if anything happens to them while they're in your care, I'll come back. And next time I won't be asking questions." The front door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and wind. Tom paused in the doorway. 24 hours, he said. "Then I want answers." The door closed, and Ezra stood alone with 3 children who weren't entirely human, and 24 hours to prevent a catastrophe he couldn't yet comprehend. Outside, the storm sang its ancient songs, and somewhere in the darkness, forces beyond his understanding began to move. The house felt impossibly quiet after Tom's departure, the storm's howl muffled by walls that suddenly seemed paper-thin. Ezra stood frozen beside the kitchen table, his heart hammering against his ribs as the full weight of his situation crashed down like an avalanche. 24 hours, less than a day to understand mysteries that had been buried for decades, to protect children whose very existence defied explanation, to somehow stay ahead of forces that had the reach and resources of the federal government behind them. He pulled the dish towel back from the babies, and they gazed up at him with those impossible eyes, ancient knowledge swimming in infant faces, as if they understood the danger closing around them. The boy baby raised one tiny fist, and Ezra felt that familiar electric tingle when their skin touched. But instead of visions, this time he sensed only a vast, patient sadness. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered to them. "How am I supposed to fight something I can't even see?" The girl baby made that singing sound again, soft as wind through winter grass, and suddenly Ezra's knees buckled. He groped for his chair and collapsed into it, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd taken on. 3 lives depending on him, Tom Carlyle's career hanging in the balance, and somewhere out there, faceless men in government cars drawing closer with each passing hour. His radio crackled from the living room, weather service updating storm warnings, road closures spreading across the county like a disease. The isolation that had been his protection was rapidly becoming his prison. When morning came and the plows cleared the roads, nothing would stop federal agents from driving straight to his door. The telephone rang. The sound cut through the kitchen like a scythe, 3 sharp bursts that made Ezra's blood freeze. No one called this late unless something was catastrophically wrong, or unless someone was checking to see if he was home. 4 rings, 5. The answering machine clicked on in the living room, and Ezra heard his own voice giving a brief message, followed by the tone. Then static filled the house. Whoever had called wasn't speaking, just listening to the open line. The babies began to whimper. Not the healthy crying of normal infants, but something else, a keening sound that raised the hair on Ezra's arms and made his teeth ache. They sensed something he couldn't, felt danger approaching with senses he didn't possess, The phone line went dead with a click that echoed like a gunshot. Ezra forced himself to stand, his legs shaky beneath him. He moved toward the living room window, hands trembling as he pressed his ear to the glass. The storm made it impossible to hear vehicles approaching, but every instinct screamed that he was no longer alone on this mountain. Behind him, the baby's cries grew more urgent. He turned back to them, and the moment his hands touched warm skin, the visions slammed into his consciousness with brutal force. Not the gentle sharing of knowledge he'd experienced before, but desperate fragments hurled at him like weapons. Black SUVs winding up mountain roads through swirling snow. Men in tactical gear checking weapons by dashboard light. Radio chatter about securing the assets and eliminating complications. A voice giving orders, the old man's expendable, but we need the children alive. Ezra gasped, jerking his hands back from the babies. The visions faded, leaving him blind again, but with terrible understanding burning in his chest. They weren't coming in the morning. They were coming tonight. The generator coughed in the basement, and for one heart-stopping moment, the lights flickered. In that brief darkness, Ezra glimpsed his situation with crystalline clarity. He was a 72-year-old blind man, alone in a house that might as well be made of matchsticks, trying to protect 3 helpless infants from forces that could make people disappear without a trace. He had no weapons except an old hunting rifle that hadn't been fired in years, no allies except a sheriff who'd already risked his career just by walking away, no escape routes that wouldn't end with dead babies frozen in a snowbank. The lights steadied, but Ezra remained in that darkness of understanding. Everything was falling apart, his careful plans, his desperate hope that 24 hours might somehow be enough, all of it crumbling like sand before the tide. The babies fell silent, watching him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. In that silence, Ezra heard the sound of his own defeat. He'd found them too late, understood too little, trusted too much in his ability to stand against powers that had been crushing people like him for generations. Outside, the storm began to weaken, and somewhere in the distance, the first faint rumble of vehicles carried on the wind. The boy baby reached toward him again, tiny fingers grasping at air, but this time Ezra didn't take his hand. He was afraid of what new horrors the visions might show him, afraid that touching these children would only confirm what his heart already knew. He had saved them from the cold, only to deliver them to something far worse. But as Ezra sat frozen in his despair, the boy baby's fingers found his wrist. This time, the vision didn't crash into him like a weapon. Instead, it unfolded with gentle precision, showing him something that made his breath catch in his throat. He saw himself, not as he was now, broken and defeated, but as he had been 15 years ago, standing in bright sunlight beside a massive bull that had gone mad with pain and rage. The animal's eyes rolled white with terror, foam flecking its muzzle as it charged toward a fallen ranch hand. And there was Ezra, younger and sighted, stepping directly into the bull's path without hesitation. The vision shifted, showing him the moment of impact from an impossible perspective, as if he were watching from above. He saw his own body thrown through the air, saw the devastating blow that had stolen his sight forever. But he also saw what he'd never known. The fallen ranch hand was pregnant. Sarah Martinez, barely 19, clutching her belly as the bull bore down on her. His sacrifice had saved 2 lives. The vision changed again, flowing like water into new scenes. He saw himself learning to navigate his world without sight, developing the supernatural awareness that unnerved his neighbors. But now he understood what that awareness truly was. Not just adaptation, but awakening. The trauma that had taken his physical sight had opened something else, something that made him capable of seeing truths others missed. He watched himself finding the babies under his porch, but from their perspective. They had been calling to him, not with voices, but with something deeper, a resonance that only someone like him could detect. They hadn't been abandoned here by chance. They had been delivered to the one person in the valley who could truly see them for what they were. The final image hit him like lightning. Dozens of children, Native American faces stretching back through generations. all connected by invisible threads to the 3 infants in his kitchen, families that had vanished, bloodlines that had been deliberately severed, ancient knowledge that someone had tried to erase forever. These babies weren't just survivors, they were the key to healing wounds that had festered for a century. When the vision ended, Ezra found himself weeping, not from despair, but from understanding that transformed everything. The boy baby's tiny hand still gripped his finger, and in that touch, he felt strength flowing between them, not his strength protecting them, their strength protecting him. The rumble of approaching vehicles grew louder. Ezra stood, no longer the broken old man who had been ready to surrender. His movements were fluid, purposeful, guided by certainty that burned away fear. He wrapped the babies carefully in their blankets, then carried them toward the basement stairs. "You're not just showing me the past," he whispered to them as he descended into darkness. "You're showing me what needs to happen next." The basement held more than his generator and storm supplies. In the far corner, hidden behind stacked firewood, was the entrance to something his grandfather had built during the Prohibition, a root cellar that connected to natural caves extending deep into the mountain. Ezra had discovered it as a child, but never had reason to use it, until now. As he pulled aside the concealing wood, the babies began to sing together, that ethereal sound Tom had found so unnerving. But Ezra finally understood what it was, a song of guidance, frequencies that painted the cave system in his mind with perfect clarity. They were showing him the way. Above them, car doors slammed in his driveway. Ezra moved through the hidden entrance, the baby's song mapping every twist and turn of passages carved by water and time. Behind him, he heard boots on his porch, voices shouting orders, the splintering of wood as they broke down his door. But they were already too late. Deep in the mountain's heart, following paths illuminated by voices older than memory, Ezra understood the final truth that had eluded him. He wasn't rescuing these children from forces beyond his understanding. They were rescuing him from a blindness that went far deeper than damaged eyes. The men searching his empty house were hunting ghosts, the real power, the ancient bloodline that connected past to future, the healing that could repair generations of damage, was already beyond their reach, flowing like underground rivers toward a reckoning they couldn't prevent. In the darkness of the caves, 3 impossible babies sang their people home, and a blind cowboy finally learned to see. The revelation changed everything. The hunt was just beginning, but for the first time since finding them, Ezra knew they were going to win. The cave system stretched before them like the ribs of some ancient creature, carved by millennia of patient water into passages that defied the mountain's hostile surface. Ezra moved through the darkness with newfound confidence, the baby's harmonious song painting each tunnel junction in his mind with crystalline clarity. Their voices had transformed from mysterious sounds into something far more profound, a navigation system that connected him to knowledge buried deeper than any government conspiracy. Behind them, the sounds of the search grew distant, muffled by tons of stone and earth. Ezra could still hear them, though. Boots thundering through his house, voices barking orders, the crash of overturned furniture. They were being thorough, systematic, but they were searching in a world that operated by their rules. Down here, older laws applied. The babies fell silent as the passage opened into a vast chamber, their work complete. Ezra felt the change in air pressure, heard his footsteps echo off distant walls. This wasn't just another tunnel, it was a destination. A place where the mountain's heart beat in rhythm with something far more ancient than federal authority. "Holy hell!" a voice whispered from the darkness ahead. Ezra froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the bundled babies. But then the voice's owner stepped into a shaft of pale light filtering down from somewhere high above, and Ezra's tension transformed into something approaching wonder. Tom Carlyle stood in the chamber's center, no longer wearing his sheriff's uniform. Instead, he was dressed in heavy work clothes, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. But what stopped Ezra's breath was what Tom held in his hands, a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows on cave walls covered with paintings. "You're not the only one who got a wake-up call tonight," Tom said, his voice carrying new weight. "About 20 minutes after I left your place, my grandmother called. First time she's spoken to me in 3 years. He gestured at the painted walls around them. Said it was time I learned what happened to my great-uncle's family back in 52. Ezra moved closer, the babies stirring restlessly in his arms. In the lantern light, the cave paintings seemed to pulse with life, human figures fleeing through mountain passes, children hidden in sacred places, families torn apart by forces represented as dark shadows with reaching claws. And there, in the newest section of artwork, were 3 small figures that made Ezra's heart skip. "She's been coming down here for 30 years, Tom continued, keeping the record alive, waiting for someone to bring them home. His eyes fixed on the bundle in Ezra's arms, waiting for them. The girl baby made a sound, not quite crying, not quite singing, and Tom stepped closer. This time he didn't flinch at the otherworldly quality of her voice. Instead, he extended one calloused finger, and when she grasped it, his face transformed with understanding. "Jesus," he breathed. "They're not just Native American, are they? They're something else entirely." "They're what was taken," Ezra said, the words rising from depths he hadn't known he possessed. The bloodline that connected people to the land, to each other, to knowledge that someone decided was too dangerous to survive. Footsteps echoed from multiple tunnel entrances, not the heavy boots of federal agents, but softer sounds, people moving with reverence rather than aggression. Tom raised his lantern, and figures emerged from the shadows like ghosts materializing from memory. An elderly Native American woman with silver braids moved forward first, her eyes bright with tears as she looked at the babies. Behind her came others, people Ezra recognized from town but had never truly seen. The quiet grocery clerk who always seemed to know things before they happened, the mechanic whose weather predictions were more accurate than the National Weather Service, the librarian who kept certain books hidden in back rooms. "We've been waiting," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, scattered, hidden, afraid to gather because they were always watching. "But tonight something called us home." She extended weathered hands toward the babies, and they responded with that ethereal singing that seemed to resonate in the cave walls themselves. "Mary Running Bear," Tom said quietly, introducing his grandmother. "Keeper of the old ways, keeper of the truth they tried to bury." Mary's hands hovered over the babies without quite touching them, tears streaming down her cheeks. "3 generations we've lost, 3 generations of children who carried the gifts, taken in the night, never seen again. The agents, the adoptions that weren't adoptions, the families that just disappeared." She looked up at Ezra, and in her ancient eyes he saw recognition that went beyond gratitude. "You didn't find them by accident, did you? You felt them calling across all those miles, through dimensions that don't have names." Ezra nodded, understanding flooding through him like warm water. His blindness hadn't been a disability, it had been preparation. The supernatural awareness that unnerved his neighbors wasn't adaptation, it was awakening to gifts that ran deeper than sight. "They're gathering," Mary continued, glancing toward the tunnel entrances where more footsteps echoed. "People who've been hiding their abilities for decades, afraid of what happened to the families before them. But the children are singing them home." The babies' voices rose in harmony, and Ezra felt the mountain itself responding. Not just the stone and earth, but something alive within it. Something that had been waiting patiently for the bloodline to return. Above them, federal agents searched an empty house, following rules and procedures that meant nothing in this deeper world. But here in the mountains, heart, surrounded by people who carried gifts the government couldn't understand or control, Ezra finally grasped the scope of what they were truly fighting. This wasn't about hiding 3 babies. This was about reclaiming a power that had been systematically destroyed, gathering the scattered pieces of something that could heal more than individual wounds. The hunt was indeed just beginning, but now they had an army. The weight of their gathering army should have brought comfort, but as Ezra stood in the heart of the mountain, surrounded by people who had emerged from decades of hiding, A cold certainty settled in his chest. They had found sanctuary, yes, but sanctuary wasn't victory. Above them, federal agents were discovering his empty house, and soon they would expand their search. The mountain that sheltered them would become their tomb if they didn't act. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of reunion conversations. The painted walls seemed to absorb his words, ancient eyes watching from the artwork, as if weighing his resolve. "They'll bring dogs, ground-penetrating radar, whatever it takes. This mountain won't hide us forever." Mary, running bare, looked up from where she'd been whispering to the babies in a language that predated English on this continent. Her weathered face held the patience of someone who had waited 30 years for this moment, but also the steel of someone who understood the cost of that waiting. "The children aren't strong enough yet," she said. "The connection is still forming. If we move them too soon, if we don't move them, there won't be a later." Ezra shifted the boy baby higher in his arms, feeling the infant's tiny fingers grasp at his shirt with surprising strength. "I've been running from this fight for 15 years, telling myself I was just a broken-down ranch hand who needed to stay out of everyone's way. But they found us anyway. They were always going to find us." Tom stepped closer, the lantern light carving harsh shadows across his face. "What are you saying, Ezra?" The answer crystallized in Ezra's mind with the inevitability of avalanche. He had felt it building since the moment he'd crawled under his porch and discovered impossible lives in need of protection. Every choice since then, hiding the babies, lying to authorities, fleeing into the mountain, had been steps along a path that led to only one destination. "I'm saying we stop hiding." The words tasted like metal and determination. "They've been hunting our people for generations, picking us off one by one, making us disappear because we were too scattered to fight back. But look around." He gestured at the gathered faces, people who had spent lifetimes concealing abilities that made them targets. "We're not scattered anymore." A man Ezra recognized as the town mechanic, Robert Ironcloud, he remembered now, shifted nervously near one of the tunnel entrances. "You're talking about a war. They have resources we can't imagine. Legal authority, weapons." "They have those things because they've been fighting people who were trying to stay hidden," Mary interrupted, rising slowly to her feet. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had kept sacred knowledge alive through decades of persecution. "But what if we stopped hiding? What if we made them fight us in the open, where the whole world could see?" The girl baby began to sing, a single piercing note that seemed to resonate in the cave walls themselves. As her voice rose, the other two infants joined her, their harmonies creating something that made the painted figures on the walls appear to move in the flickering lantern light. Ezra felt their song differently now, not just as guidance or communication, but as power, raw and ancient and patient. Power that had been suppressed for generations, driven underground, almost extinguished. But not quite, never quite. "They're not just showing us the past," he realized aloud, his blind eyes fixed on nothing and seeing everything. "They're showing us what we could become again." The visions came gently this time, shared among all of them through the baby's song. Ezra heard gasps and murmurs as others saw what he saw, communities where people with gifts lived openly, healing the sick with touches that defied medical science, predicting weather patterns that saved lives, communicating with the land itself to prevent disasters. A world where the abilities they'd been taught to hide were celebrated as connections to something sacred. "The government didn't just steal children," Tom breathed, understanding flooding his voice. "They stole the future, made us afraid of what we are." The song faded, but its echoes lingered in Ezra's bones. He looked around the chamber at faces transformed by shared vision, at people who were no longer just refugees hiding in the dark, but inheritors of something that had always been meant to grow. "They'll come for us," he said quietly. "Tonight, tomorrow, next week. They won't stop. But this time we don't run. This time we make them explain to the world why they're so afraid of 3 babies and the people who protect them." Above them, search dogs began barking in the distance. The hunters were closing in, following scent trails that would eventually lead to the cave entrances. But for the first time since he'd heard desperate whimpering under his porch, Ezra wasn't afraid. The road back to what they had lost would be written in the confrontation to come. The barking grew closer, echoing through stone passages like the baying of hounds pursuing souls through purgatory. But instead of scrambling deeper into the mountain's protection, Ezra found himself moving toward the sound. The babies stirred in his arms, their breathing synchronized with his heartbeat, and he felt their ancient patience flowing into him, like medicine for wounds he'd carried since the stampede took his sight. "This is it," he whispered, not to the gathered people behind him, but to the 3 impossible lives he cradled. "Everything I've learned, everything you've shown me, it comes down to the next hour." Mary, running bare, fell into step beside him as he approached the main tunnel that led back toward his ranch. Her weathered hands moved in patterns that seemed to pull strength from the cave walls themselves, and Ezra realized she was preparing for something far beyond hiding. "The old stories speak of moments like this," she murmured, her voice carrying both reverence and steel. "When the scattered seeds finally take root again, when what was broken remembers how to be whole." Tom's lantern cast their shadows ahead of them, stretching like giants toward the approaching voices. Behind them, the others followed, not fleeing anymore, but advancing with purpose that transformed the mountain passages into something resembling a war march. Ezra could feel their gifts awakening in the darkness. The mechanic whose hands could sense metal through solid rock, the librarian whose memory held every story that had ever been told, the grocery clerk who could taste lies in the air like smoke. They were no longer hiding what they were. And that change, Ezra realized, made them dangerous in ways the government couldn't have predicted. The tunnel opened into the natural chamber where the cave system connected to his grandfather's old root cellar. Flashlight beams were already probing the entrance, and voices echoed down the stone throat, federal agents who had found the hidden door and were now descending into darkness they couldn't understand. "Federal agents," the lead voice bounced off cave walls, distorted into something almost inhuman. "We know you're down there. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt." Ezra stepped into the chamber where artificial light met ancient stone and felt the weight of every lesson these babies had taught him. His blindness, which had seemed like loss for 15 years, now revealed itself as the greatest gift he'd ever received. While the agent stumbled through unfamiliar darkness, he moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to see with more than eyes. "Nobody's hiding," he called back, his voice carrying clearly through the stone. "We're right here." The lead agent emerged from the tunnel, tactical gear making him look like some armored insect in the lantern light. His flashlight beam found Ezra first, then the babies in his arms, and Ezra heard the sharp intake of breath that spoke of recognition and fear. "Agent Morrison, Federal Child Services," the man said, though his hand rested on his sidearm rather than any social worker's clipboard. "You're interfering with a federal investigation. Hand over the children and we can discuss this reasonably." Reasonably. Ezra tasted the word like poison. The way you discussed things reasonably with the families in 1952, the way you reasonably made children disappear for 3 generations. More agents poured from the tunnel behind Morrison, but they stopped when they saw the gathered crowd of townspeople emerging from side passages. Ordinary citizens who had spent lifetimes hiding extraordinary gifts, now standing openly in the light. Ezra felt their combined presence like electricity in his bones. Morrison's flashlight swept across the painted walls, and his voice tightened with something beyond professional concern. "Those are classified historical records. Unauthorized personnel are not permitted." "Classified?" Mary, running bare, stepped forward, and when she spoke, her words seemed to resonate from the cave walls themselves. "You classified the murder of my family? You classified the theft of our children?" The girl baby began to sing, her voice threading through the tension like silver wire. As her brothers joined the harmony, something extraordinary happened. The painted figures on the walls began to move, not physically, but in the minds of everyone present. Federal agents and hidden gifted alike shared the same vision: generations of children taken in darkness, families destroyed, knowledge deliberately erased. But they also saw what those children might have become, the healing they could have brought, the connection to the land that could have prevented disasters, the wisdom that could have bridged the gap between ancient understanding and modern need. "Dear God," one of the younger agents whispered, his weapon forgotten. "What have we been doing?" Morrison raised his sidearm, but his hand shook as the baby's song grew stronger, not threatening, revealing, stripping away decades of lies and justifications, exposing the naked truth of what the systematic persecution had cost them all. Ezra stepped forward, no longer the broken cowboy who had been ready to surrender. He was the man these impossible children had always seen in him, the bridge between worlds, the guardian of something that refused to be destroyed. "The test isn't whether we can hide from you," he said quietly. "It's whether you can face what you've done, and what happens next." The baby's song reached crescendo, and the mountain itself seemed to listen. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, but the baby's song had become something more than sound. It was revelation made audible, truth that carved through 40 years of carefully constructed justifications. Around the chamber, agents who had entered as hunters now stood transfixed, their tactical gear suddenly seeming like costumes worn by men playing at authority they'd never truly possessed. "Shut them up!" Morrison snarled, his voice cracking under pressure that had nothing to do with the federal badge on his chest. "Whatever they're doing, make it stop!" But Ezra could feel the change spreading through the chamber like wildfire. The babies weren't just singing, they were awakening something in every person present, agent and gifted alike. Memories that had been buried, connections that had been severed, understanding that 3 generations of systematic persecution had tried to destroy. Agent Collins, the younger man who had whispered his horror, lowered his weapon completely. "Sir, we need to stand down. This isn't what we were told. You'll follow orders or face court-martial." Morrison swung his sidearm toward his own man, and in that moment, Ezra saw the true face of what they'd been fighting, not government policy or institutional procedure, but personal terror masquerading as duty. Morrison wasn't just afraid of losing control, he was afraid of what that control had always cost him. The baby's harmony shifted, became something ancient and implacable. The painted walls seemed to pulse with their rhythm, and suddenly everyone in the chamber shared the same vision. Morrison himself, 30 years younger, standing over a burning cabin while a native family screamed inside. The moment that had made him into the monster who could sleep at night only by believing his victims deserved their fate. "You were there," Mary Running Bear said, her voice heavy with recognition. "The Clearwater Massacre, 1957. You were the one who lit the match." Morrison's hand shook violently now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cave's chill. They were dangerous. The whole family was infected with whatever genetic aberration produces these abilities. "We had orders." "You had choices," Ezra interrupted, stepping closer. The babies in his arms had grown warm, their small bodies radiating heat that seemed to come from something deeper than biology. "Every time you took a child, every time you destroyed a family, you chose to be afraid instead of trying to understand." The girl baby reached out tiny fingers toward Morrison, and her touch seemed to travel across space itself. The federal agent jerked as if struck, his weapon clattering to stone as visions flooded his mind, not just his own crimes, but what his victims might have become. Children who could have healed diseases, prevented natural disasters, bridged the gap between human understanding and something infinitely larger. 40 years, Morrison whispered, his knees buckling. 40 years of hunting them down because we were told they were dangerous. But we were the dangerous ones. We were always the dangerous ones. Around the chamber, other agents were lowering their weapons, their faces transformed by understanding that cut deeper than orders or protocol. Some wept openly as the baby's song showed them the true scope of what their fear had destroyed. But Morrison wasn't finished. Even broken by revelation, he lunged forward with the desperate fury of a man who couldn't survive the weight of his own truth. "If I'm a monster, then I'll be the monster they made me." He pulled a backup weapon, aiming not at Ezra but at the babies themselves. In that crystalline moment, Ezra felt every lesson his blindness had taught him, every gift these impossible children had awakened, every connection to something larger than himself that 15 years of darkness had revealed. He moved without thought, positioning himself between the weapon and the babies. But he wasn't alone. Tom stepped beside him, then Mary, then every person in the chamber who had spent lifetimes hiding what they truly were, a wall of bodies and will that said, with absolute finality, "No more." The baby's song reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the mountain itself. The painted figures on the walls blazed with light that had nothing to do with lanterns or flashlights, ancient power awakening after generations of suppression, flowing through people who finally understood what they'd been born to protect. Morrison pulled the trigger, but the bullet never reached its target. It hung suspended in air that had become thick as honey, caught in a web of collective will that transformed the chamber into something beyond the reach of ordinary physics. "It's over," Ezra said quietly, his blind eyes fixed on Morrison with perfect clarity. "Not just your hunt, not just your war against our people. All of it. The hiding, the fear, the systematic destruction of gifts that were meant to heal the world. We're done being afraid of what we are." The baby's song gentled into something like a lullaby, but their message was clear. The scattered seeds Mary had spoken of weren't just taking root. They were blooming into something the government had spent 40 years trying to prevent. The reckoning had finally begun. The suspended bullet fell to the stone floor with a sound like a bell tolling, and in that moment of profound silence, Ezra understood what victory would cost him. The baby's song had gentled to whispers, but their message blazed through his mind with terrible clarity. They weren't just showing him the future anymore, they were showing him the choice. The world would change because of this night, because of what had been revealed in this ancient chamber. The gifts that had been suppressed for generations would emerge into daylight, protected by laws and understanding instead of hidden in fear. But bridges burned from both ends. Morrison lay crumpled against the cave wall, his mind shattered by revelations that had stripped away 40 years of carefully constructed justifications. Around him, federal agents stood transformed, weapons abandoned as they grappled with the scope of what their fear had destroyed. Some wept openly. Others stared at their hands as if seeing them for the first time, wondering what gifts they might have carried if the world had been different. "They'll send others," Agent Collins said quietly, his young face aged by understanding. "When we don't report back, when Morrison's superiors realize what's happened here, they'll send others who can't be reached by truth." Tom nodded grimly. "The program's run too deep. Too many people have built careers on hunting us. They can't afford to let this spread." Ezra felt the weight of the boy baby in his arms, the child's breathing synchronized with his heartbeat as it had been since that first impossible morning under his porch. 3 weeks. It had been only 3 weeks since desperate whimpering had drawn him into a mystery that changed everything he thought he knew about the world and himself. "The children can't stay hidden anymore," Mary said, her weathered hands gentle on the girl baby's forehead. "What they've awakened tonight, it's bigger than any of us can contain. People all over the world who have been hiding gifts will feel what happened here. They'll start emerging, start connecting with each other." The babies looked up at Ezra with ancient eyes, and he saw his choice reflected in their impossible depth. They could return to his ranch, continue hiding in the mountains until the heat died down. The 3 of them could disappear into the wilderness he knew better than any federal agent, living quietly on the edges of a world that wasn't ready for what they represented. Or he could do what every instinct born of 15 years, protecting his careful solitude, screamed against. "We go public," he said, the words cutting through him like winter wind. "All of us. No more hiding, no more running. We walk out of this mountain and tell the world everything." Tom's lantern flickered. throwing shifting shadows across faces that had been transformed by revelation. Ezra, you know what that means. The ranch, your privacy, the life you've built. Once this gets out, none of it will ever be the same. You'll never have peace again. The truth of it settled in Ezra's chest like lead. His grandfather's land, the carefully memorized paths that let him navigate without sight, the quiet rhythms of a life lived on his own terms, all of it would be sacrificed on the altar of a larger truth. Media attention, government scrutiny, curiosity seekers and researchers, and people who would never see him as anything more than the blind cowboy who found the miracle babies. But as the girl baby's tiny fingers closed around his thumb with surprising strength, he understood what she had been trying to show him since that first shared vision. Some things were worth more than personal peace. The world these children are meant to create, he said quietly, it's bigger than my comfort, bigger than any of our comfort. Mary Running Bear smiled, her face radiant despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the land teaches us that growth requires breaking through the soil. One by one, the others nodded their acceptance. The mechanic who could sense metal through solid rock, the librarian whose memory held every story ever told, the grocery clerk who could taste lies in the air, all of them understanding that the careful anonymity that had protected them would be destroyed by the choice to protect something larger. Outside the mountain, dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Valley. Ezra could feel it in his bones, the way he'd learned to sense the passage of time through changes too subtle for sighted eyes to catch. Soon, news crews would arrive, federal authorities who couldn't be swayed by revelation, scientists and skeptics and believers who would transform his quiet ranch into a battlefield of competing interests. But as they began the long walk back through stone passages toward daylight, the baby's song rose one final time. Not the ancient harmonies that had awakened power in the chamber, but something new, a melody that spoke of seeds taking root, of scattered people finding each other, of gifts emerging from shadow into light. The victory was complete. The cost was everything he'd held precious, and somehow, in the arithmetic of sacrifice, the balance was exactly right. The resolution. The first reporters arrived before they even reached the ranch house. Ezra heard the vehicles grinding up his private road while they were still half a mile out, engines straining against the grade, unfamiliar tire treads crunching over gravel that had known only his old pickup and the occasional supply truck for 15 years. The babies stirred in his arms as if they too sensed the approaching storm, their soft breathing quickening in rhythm with his accelerating heartbeat. 3 news vans, Tom reported quietly, his voice tight with exhaustion and something approaching grief. Satellite dishes already going up. Looks like word travels faster than we hoped. Mary Running Bear adjusted her grip on the girl baby, her weathered face serene despite the chaos waiting ahead. The children's song last night, it reached further than just our valley. People with gifts all over the country felt what happened. Some of them are already talking. Agent Collins, who had insisted on walking with them despite the professional suicide it represented, checked his radio with shaking hands. My superiors are demanding immediate contact. Federal task forces mobilizing from 3 states. This is going to get ugly fast. They crested the final hill, and Ezra's ranch spread below them in the morning light, transformed into something he barely recognized. News crews clustered around his front porch like carrion birds, their equipment cables snaking across pasture land his grandfather had worked with hand tools. Satellite trucks blocked the lane where he'd learned to guide cattle by sound and memory alone. The careful geography of his blindness, 15 years of memorized paths and trusted landmarks, had been obliterated in a single morning. We can still turn back, Tom said softly, understanding the magnitude of what Ezra was witnessing. Take the children up to the old mining camps, wait this out until the heat dies down. But the boy baby made a sound that might have been disagreement, his tiny hand clutching Ezra's shirt with surprising determination. Through their impossible connection, Ezra felt the child's certainty. Retreat now would mean hiding forever. The momentum generated by last night's revelations couldn't be stopped, only guided. "No," Ezra said, though the word came out rougher than he intended. "We finish what we started." They walked down the hillside together, an odd procession that would define everything that followed. A blind 72-year-old cowboy carrying babies that shouldn't exist. A Salish elder whose memory held generations of stolen children. A hardware store owner whose gifts had hidden behind small-town anonymity for 6 decades. A federal agent whose career was ending with every step toward the cameras. The first reporter spotted them when they reached the fence line. Shouts erupted across the pasture as crews scrambled for position, expensive equipment jostling for the best angles. Ezra felt their attention like physical pressure against his skin, the weight of scrutiny that would never lift again. "Mr. Blackwood," the voices merged into an incomprehensible wall of sound. "Where did the babies come from? Is it true they have supernatural abilities? What's your connection to the missing families? Are you working with government cover-up programs?" The questions hammered at him as they approached his front porch, each one a reminder of how completely his private world had been shattered. These strangers knew details about his life that he'd never shared with another soul. Someone had done their research, turned his carefully guarded history into public consumption. Agent Collins stepped forward, his badge raised, though it would likely be meaningless within hours. "Federal authorities are conducting an ongoing investigation. Any interference with witnesses will result in prosecution." But Ezra could hear the hollowness in the younger man's voice. They both knew the traditional power structures were crumbling in real time. The babies had awakened something that couldn't be contained by federal badges or official protocols. At the porch steps, the same weathered boards where he'd first heard desperate whimpering 3 weeks ago, Ezra paused. The reporters pressed closer, cameras clicking and whirring as they captured the moment for history. He thought of his grandfather, who had chosen this isolated valley specifically to avoid the complications of modern life. The old man would have been horrified by the circus his ranch had become, but he would have understood the necessity. The girl baby looked up at Ezra with eyes that held depths no infant should possess, and in that gaze he saw confirmation of what they'd chosen. The world would change because of this moment. Children who had spent lifetimes hiding extraordinary gifts would emerge into daylight. Families separated by 40 years of systematic persecution would begin finding each other. The cost would be his peace, his privacy, his carefully constructed independence. But the arithmetic still balanced. As he turned to face the cameras, 3 impossible children in his arms and the weight of their shared future pressing against his shoulders, Ezra Blackwood prepared to speak the words that would transform everything. The reckoning had moved beyond the mountain, beyond the valley, beyond anything any of them could control. It was exactly as it should be. The return. "These children," Ezra began, his voice carrying across the sudden hush, "came to me 3 weeks ago. What they've taught me about the world, what they've taught all of us, changes everything." The words felt strange in his mouth, formal speech after a lifetime of talking mainly to cattle and wind. But as cameras recorded and satellite feeds carried his image across the country, Ezra found unexpected steadiness in the baby's presence. They had prepared him for this moment through every shared vision, every impossible dream. He told their story simply, without embellishment or theory. The whimpering under his porch, the visions that showed him things his blind eyes couldn't see, the connection to families that had vanished into government programs, designed to hide the truth about human potential. When he finished, the questions came like hail. "Mr. Blackwood, are you claiming these infants have psychic abilities? Where are their biological parents? What evidence do you have of government conspiracy?" Through it all, the babies remained calm in his arms, their presence an anchor of certainty in the storm of attention. But it was Mary running bare who stepped forward to address what the reporters couldn't understand. "This isn't about proving anything to you," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 40 years of systematic persecution. "This is about children like these finally being safe to exist in the world." The press conference lasted 3 hours. By the time it ended, Ezra's phone was ringing constantly with calls from researchers, government officials, families claiming their own children had similar gifts. The quiet ranch that had sheltered him since losing his sight had become the center of a storm that would never fully pass. Over the following weeks, the changes came in waves. First, the families. Parents who had hidden their children's abilities for years began arriving at the ranch, drawn by news coverage that finally gave them permission to speak openly. A mother whose daughter could heal animals with touch, a father whose son could sense earthquakes days before they struck, children who had spent their lives believing they were broken or dangerous, finding community for the first time. Tom worked tirelessly to accommodate them, setting up temporary shelters in the barn and coordinating with local authorities who were struggling to understand the legal implications. The hardware store owner had become an unofficial diplomat, his lifetime of hiding behind small-town normalcy transformed into skills for managing the extraordinary. Agent Collins, whose career had ended the moment he chose truth over protocol, found unexpected purpose helping families navigate federal bureaucracy. The programs that had stolen children for 40 years were being systematically exposed and dismantled, but the process was slow and bureaucratic. Someone who understood the system from the inside was invaluable. Mary Running Bear became the unofficial historian, recording stories that had been buried for generations. Each family brought pieces of a larger puzzle, children taken, abilities suppressed, entire bloodlines scattered across the country to prevent them from finding each other. The scope of what had been hidden was staggering, but it was the children themselves who showed Ezra how completely his world had changed. The babies were growing faster than they should, their development accelerated by whatever force had created them. Within a month, they were sitting up, their ancient eyes tracking movement with impossible awareness. They seemed to recognize every person who came to the ranch, responding to visitors as if they shared some deeper connection than biology could explain. When Dr. Sarah Chen arrived from Stanford to study them, the babies allowed her examination with patient tolerance. The neurologist's equipment detected brain activity unlike anything in medical literature, patterns that suggested consciousness operating on multiple levels simultaneously. "They're not just telepathic," Dr. Chen explained to Ezra as they sat on his porch, watching children play in the pasture where he used to move cattle by memory alone. "Their neural networks appear to be connected to something larger, like they're part of a distributed consciousness that extends beyond individual biology." Ezra nodded, unsurprised. He had felt that connection since the first morning, the sense that the babies were both utterly present and somehow reaching toward something vast and distant. Through them, he had learned that human potential extended far beyond what science currently understood. The hardest change was the most personal. His carefully memorized ranch had been transformed beyond recognition. Paths he had navigated by counting steps were blocked by equipment and temporary structures. Familiar sounds were overwhelmed by constant human activity. The quiet rhythms that had allowed him to function independently were broken. Some mornings, Ezra felt lost on his own land. But when despair threatened to overwhelm him, the babies would reach for him with tiny hands, sharing visions of what was growing from the chaos. Across the country, children who had hidden extraordinary gifts their entire lives were emerging into communities of understanding. Research centers were being established to study abilities that had been suppressed for generations. The systematic persecution that had scattered families for 40 years was being replaced by protection and nurture. The world was becoming what the babies had shown him in those first impossible dreams, a place where human potential could flourish instead of hide. As winter settled over the Bitterroot Valley, Ezra Blackwood sat on his transformed porch, listening to the sounds of children playing in snow that sparkled with more than reflected sunlight. He was no longer the isolated rancher who had lost his sight and found independence in solitude. He had become something he never expected, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of impossible children, a voice for gifts the world was finally ready to embrace. The arithmetic of sacrifice had proven exact. Everything he had lost was balanced by everything the children would gain. The new beginning. Spring came early to the Bitterroot Valley, and with it a rhythm Ezra had never imagined possible. He woke not to silence and solitude, but to the sound of children's laughter drifting through windows that no longer needed to stay shuttered against the world. The babies, now walking toddlers with eyes that still held ancient wisdom, had learned to navigate his morning routine with him, their small hands guiding him around obstacles that shifted daily as the ranch continued its transformation into something unprecedented. "Ezra?" Sarah's voice came from the kitchen, where the smell of coffee mixed with something sweeter. Dr. Chen had moved into the guest room 3 months ago, her research having evolved into something more like kinship with the children she studied. "The delegation from Norway arrives this afternoon." He nodded, adjusting the boy's weight on his hip as the child babbled in sounds that occasionally resembled words. Through their connection, Ezra sensed anticipation, not from the toddler, but from something vast and patient that spoke through him. The Norwegian children they were expecting had gifts involving the aurora borealis, abilities that had been suppressed by families who feared persecution. The babies somehow knew they were coming. Outside, construction sounds had replaced the cattle calls that once marked his days. The Blackwood Institute, a name he'd reluctantly accepted when the lawyers insisted on formal incorporation, was taking shape across his former pastures. Research facilities designed specifically for studying human potential, housing for families who had traveled across continents to find safety for their gifted children. A library where Mary Running Bear was compiling stories that had been hidden for generations. Tom appeared in the doorway, his hardware store practicality now applied to coordinating international arrivals and federal oversight. The new dormitory passed inspection. "We can house 30 more families by summer." 30 more families. Ezra remembered when the arrival of a single delivery truck had been a notable event on his ranch. Now children from 6 countries called this place home, their extraordinary abilities flourishing under protection he'd never imagined possible. The girl toddler, they'd named her Hope at Mary's suggestion, tugged at his sleeve with tiny fingers that could somehow see colors through touch. Through their bond, she showed him what the ranch looked like from her impossible perspective, patterns of light connecting every person on the property, threads of potential weaving through the air like visible music. It was beautiful beyond anything his sighted eyes had ever witnessed. Agent Collins, now Director Collins of the Federal Department for Extraordinary Human Studies, arrived before lunch with updates from Washington. The programs that had stolen children for 4 decades were being systematically dismantled, but the work was delicate. 40 years of hidden families didn't emerge into daylight overnight. "We've identified 17 more facilities," Collins reported, as they walked paths that Ezra navigated now by following the mental maps the children shared with him. But the good news is overwhelming. Applications for the protection program are coming from every state. The embassy requests from other countries suggest this is happening globally. The third toddler, the one they called Bridge, pressed his palm against Ezra's chest as if listening to his heartbeat. Through that touch came a flood of images. Children in Prague discovering they could speak to electronics. A family in Kyoto realizing their son's dreams predicted weather patterns. Researchers in Sao Paulo documenting abilities that had no names in any language. The awakening the babies had triggered was spreading across the world like seeds on wind. That evening, as delegations settled into accommodations that had replaced his storage sheds, Ezra sat on his porch with the 3 children who had changed everything. The boards beneath his feet were the same weathered planks where he'd first heard desperate whimpering 6 months ago, but they supported a different man now. He was no longer the isolated rancher protecting his independence through careful solitude. He was the guardian of impossible children, the voice for gifts the world was learning to embrace, the bridge between what humanity had been and what it was becoming. Mary Running Bear joined them as sunset painted the valley in colors the children described through shared sensation. She carried the worn leather journal where she recorded each new story, each recovered family, each child who no longer needed to hide extraordinary gifts behind ordinary faces. "Your grandfather's land," she said softly, watching construction lights begin to twinkle across the property like earthbound stars. "It's become what he always knew it could be, a place where things grow that couldn't grow anywhere else." The babies, toddlers now, but still connected to something vast and ancient, looked up at Ezra with eyes that reflected depths beyond human understanding. Through their impossible bond, he felt their certainty about what was coming. More children would emerge from hiding. More families would find each other. The systematic suppression of human potential that had defined the past 40 years would become the foundation for something unprecedented. His sacrifice had been complete. His solitude, his privacy, his carefully constructed independence, all of it transformed into something larger than personal peace. But as small hands reached for him in the gathering darkness, as children's voices carried across land that had become sanctuary for gifts the world was finally ready to nurture, Ezra Blackwood understood the arithmetic had balanced perfectly. He had lost everything he thought he needed. He had gained everything the world required.